In the vast and unforgiving Pacific of World War II, battles were often decided not by armies or admirals, but by a single man's courage to break the rules. Among the countless stories of valor, one stands apart: the legend of Captain Daniel Reeves, the maverick pilot who dared to defy orders and changed naval warfare forever. When conventional bombing tactics failed to stop Japanese convoys supplying their island strongholds, Reeves refused to accept defeat. Flying dangerously low, just 200 feet above the ocean, he discovered a devastating technique: dropping bombs so close to the water that the explosions detonated beneath enemy ships, cracking their hulls apart with underwater shock waves. It was a maneuver officially forbidden, too risky, too unpredictable, and too deadly for both plane and pilot. But Reeves didn't care about rules. He cared about results. Over 3 relentless days, he took to the skies again and again, flying through anti-aircraft fire so thick it turned night into daylight. By the time the smoke cleared, 12 Japanese ships, including destroyers, transports, and fuel carriers, lay at the bottom of the sea. His squadron called it madness. His enemies called it impossible. History called it genius. Reeves's forbidden run became the stuff of legend, a tale of defiance, precision, and raw human will. It was the moment when one pilot, alone with his instincts and his courage, turned the tide of a battle and proved that sometimes victory belongs to those who dare to fly closer to death than anyone else. This is his story, the forbidden 200-foot bombing run that stunned the world, silenced the skeptics, and changed the face of aerial warfare forever. The Pacific in 1944 was a paradox of silence and fury. Between the long, glassy stretches of turquoise water and the black scars of burning wrecks, the war seemed to pause, only to explode again without warning. On a tiny coral-ringed island a few hundred miles from the Philippines, a narrow runway baked in the sun, shimmering like liquid steel. The men stationed there called it Island 12, but on maps it had no name. It was nothing more than a strip of crushed coral, a cluster of tents, and a handful of aircraft that looked too weary to keep flying. Yet from this forgotten corner of the Pacific, history was about to change. The base woke before dawn, as it always did. Mechanics moved like ghosts under the fading starlight, silhouettes against the faint orange horizon. The smell of hot oil and sea salt hung heavy in the air. Somewhere beyond the palm trees, surf hissed softly against the reef, a sound that almost drowned out the far-off rumble of war. Pilots gathered around a wooden table beneath a tarpaulin roof, sipping coffee that tasted of rust, their faces drawn tight from sleepless nights. They spoke little. Everyone on Island 12 knew that the next few days would decide whether the supply line through the southern seas lived or died. At the edge of the briefing tent stood Captain Daniel Reeves, his flight jacket unzipped, the collar dark with sweat. He was 31, tall and lean, his eyes the color of weathered steel. The younger pilots watched him the way sailors watch the horizon, half in hope, half in superstition. Reeves had flown more low-altitude attack missions than anyone in the squadron, and somehow he was still alive. His methods were legend and officially forbidden. He flew too low, too fast, too close. Command had reprimanded him twice, grounded him once. But when the reports came back listing his kill counts, the reprimands vanished into filing cabinets that no one ever opened again. That morning, the intelligence officer laid out reconnaissance photos of a Japanese convoy moving through the northern straits. 12 ships in all, transports, fuel carriers, and a pair of light escorts. They were part of the supply chain feeding the garrisons of the Philippines. If the convoy reached its destination, the enemy would dig in for months. If it could be stopped, the tide of invasion would roll unhindered. The brass wanted high-altitude strikes from bombers based hundreds of miles away. Reeves listened, jaw clenched, then looked up at the gray blur of clouds beyond the tent flap. High-altitude bombs, he knew, scattered in the wind. Only a low-level run could guarantee hits, but that was exactly what the manual forbade. He'd learned the art of low flight the hard way. In the early days of the war, Reeves had flown torpedo bombers over the Solomons, where enemy flak turned the sky into shrapnel. He'd lost friends there, good men who followed procedure and paid for it. He'd discovered by accident that a plane diving to just 200 feet above the waves could drop its bombs with devastating precision, using the water itself to amplify the blast beneath a ship's hull. It was madness, it was brilliance, but the command considered it suicidal. The official order remained clear: no bombing runs below 800 feet. Reeves carried that order folded in the pocket of his flight jacket, creased and unread. The sun crested the horizon in a blaze of gold, and the island came to life. The ground crews fueled the planes, dragging hoses across coral. Ammunition trucks rumbled down the makeshift taxiways. The base loudspeaker crackled with static and brief messages, weather updates, incoming mail, the daily rumor that the war might soon be over. Reeves ignored it all. He walked the length of his aircraft, a twin-engine attack plane scarred with bullet holes patched by aluminum plates. Its nose art, a dark-haired pin-up girl reclining beneath the words "low blow," was faded by salt and sun. He placed a hand on the fuselage, as if greeting an old friend. "You ready to break another rule?" he muttered. Inside the cockpit, the gauges trembled with life. The smell of fuel filled the air. Reeves checked the altimeter, the bomb toggles, the oxygen line. Ritual motions performed with reverence. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Hale, climbed in beside him, chewing on a piece of gum that had long since lost its flavor. "You really think they'll let you fly it your way?" Hale asked. Reeves smiled without looking up. "They won't have to let me. They'll just see the results." Behind them, the squadron commander approached, a tall man with mirrored sunglasses and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many hours staring at the sea. "Captain Reeves," he said quietly, "word from command, we stick to regulation altitude. The admiral's watching this one, no stunts." Reeves saluted crisply. "Understood, sir." The commander hesitated, studying him. "Don't make me write your obituary." Reeves didn't answer. He was already thinking about the wind, the tide, the timing of the next moonrise. That afternoon, the convoy was sighted again, threading its way between the islands. The Japanese formation was disciplined, moving just inside the cover of coastal cliffs. The waters were shallow, ideal for low-level bombing. Reeves pored over the maps in silence, his finger tracing the attack vector that he would never officially fly. 200 feet, he whispered. In, strike, out. His crew chief overheard him and shook his head. 200 feet will get you killed, Captain. Reeves replied without looking up. Not if I'm faster than the water. Night fell, and with it came the oppressive stillness that only war zones know, the silence that feels like waiting for something to break. The men played cards under dim lanterns. Somewhere a harmonica wailed a tune that made them think of home. Reeves sat alone outside his tent, watching tracer fire flicker on the distant horizon. He thought about the ship steaming through the dark, about the sailors aboard them who didn't yet know he was coming. He thought about the friends buried at sea, about the letters he'd never sent. The ocean glimmered under the starlight like a sheet of glass. He could almost see the reflection of the ships already burning in it. When the call came before dawn, pilots to briefing, Reeves was already awake. The sky was the color of ash, the wind still. The intelligence officer spoke quickly. The convoy had altered course, hugging the reef to avoid radar. They would reach open water in 3 days. Reeves looked at the map and knew that was all the time he needed. 3 days, 1 plane, 12 ships. If he flew his way, he could do it. He also knew that if he failed, no one would ever find his body. He walked back to the flight line as the first light broke across the Pacific. His crew waited by the plane, yawning, joking, unaware that the next mission would break every rule in the book. Reeves paused, breathing in the salt air. Somewhere in the distance, gulls circled, crying over the endless blue. The war was roaring again, and he could feel it in his bones. The quiet before the run was over. The legend of Captain Daniel Reeves' forbidden run didn't begin in glory. It began in failure. Months before that quiet island morning, Reeves had been a pilot like any other, flying regulation attack patterns over the Pacific. He'd done everything by the book, flown every mission by the manual. But war doesn't read manuals. The first time he tried a standard bombing run against a fast-moving Japanese convoy, his entire formation missed their targets. The bombs fell wide, splashing uselessly into the sea. The ships escaped, the convoy survived, and the mission log called it a partial success. Reeves called it something else, a waste of courage. He knew then that the war in the Pacific couldn't be won from the clouds. Japanese ships were small, fast, and expertly maneuvered. Their anti-aircraft gunners were sharp, their captains unpredictable. The big, sweeping, high-altitude bombing runs favored by the Air Corps might have worked over Europe, where targets were factories and cities, but in the island-dotted seas of the Pacific, they were next to useless. Hitting a moving ship from 10,000 feet was like dropping a stone into a puddle from a skyscraper and hoping to break a leaf. Reeves needed something better, something personal, something dangerous. He started experimenting in secret. When missions were finished and the others returned to base, Reeves would stay in the air, skimming low over empty stretches of ocean, testing the limits of his aircraft and his nerve. He watched how the wind curled off the waves, how the light changed as altitude dropped, how bombs fell when released from just a few hundred feet. He noticed something the textbooks never mentioned. When a bomb hit the water at low altitude, its momentum didn't just vanish, it transferred downward, sending shock waves beneath the surface. If timed right, those shock waves hit the underside of a ship's hull like a hammer. You didn't have to hit on the ship, you could hit under it. It was a revelation. Reeves realized that the ocean itself could be his weapon. He began refining his approach. 200 feet was the sweet spot, low enough for accuracy, high enough to clear the bomb's blast radius. Any lower and the explosion could tear the aircraft apart. Any higher and the bomb would lose its underwater shock effect. He modified his bombs with delayed fuses, 3 seconds between impact and detonation, enough time for them to sink below the surface before unleashing their fury. It was elegant, mathematical, and insane. His fellow pilots called it suicide flying. One night, Reeves tested his theory for real. He spotted an abandoned cargo ship drifting near a reef, a derelict hull stripped of guns, used for target practice. He took his twin-engine bomber down to 200 feet and released a single bomb. The explosion erupted not on the ship, but beneath it. The sea rose in a geyser of white foam. When it cleared, the ship was gone. What remained was a floating graveyard of twisted steel and shattered planks. Reeves had found the key. But the brass didn't see it that way. When he reported his findings, the senior staff at Fleet Headquarters listened in silence. Then they banned the maneuver. Low-altitude bomb runs below 800 feet are expressly prohibited, read the official memo. Such tactics endanger crew and equipment. Reeves read the order once, twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into his jacket. The rule didn't matter to him anymore. He'd seen the truth with his own eyes. To understand why Reeves' technique was so controversial, you have to understand how fragile the balance between precision and suicide really was. At 200 feet, the difference between control and catastrophe could be measured in milliseconds. A single misjudged gust could slam the plane into the sea. Anti-aircraft fire was twice as deadly at low altitude. Bullets and shrapnel came at you horizontally, ripping through the fuselage like knives. Even the ocean itself became an enemy. The slipstream from the plane's propellers kicked up spray that could clog the engines, and the turbulence near the surface made instruments useless. Pilots who tried Reeves' method rarely tried it twice. But Reeves wasn't chasing safety, he was chasing results. And deep down, he understood that war rewards the man who risks what others fear. Word of his trick spread quietly through the ranks. Young pilots whispered about the crazy American who flew lower than seagulls. Engineers called him a madman. Mechanics called him a genius. His wingman, Lieutenant Hale, just called him lucky. "One of these days," Hale said, "you'll come back in pieces." Reeves had shrugged. "Then I'll just build myself a faster plane." It wasn't bravado. It was belief. Reeves trusted the machine as much as he trusted himself. He had an instinctive understanding of how far the engines could push, how much stress the wings could bear, how to read the rhythm of the waves like a musician reading sheet music. He flew by feel, by heartbeat. "You don't fly against the sea," he told new recruits once. "You fly with it. You bend to its mood." He refined his approach every time he flew. He adjusted altitudes, recalibrated timing, even experimented with bomb weights. He began flying with one hand on the throttle and one on the bomb toggle, timing his release by sight, not instruments. 200 feet became 180. 180 became 150. Once, in a moment of reckless brilliance, he dropped to 100. The bomb detonated so close behind that the blast lifted the tail of the plane like a giant hand. Hale had screamed over the intercom, "You trying to kill us?" Reeves had just laughed, "Not today." Every mission made him better, and every success made him bolder. By the time he reached Island 12, Reeves' reputation preceded him. The low flyer, they called him. The man who defied orders and gravity alike. He didn't care about fame. He cared about effectiveness. To him, the 200-foot run wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. The manuals were written for yesterday's wars, and he was fighting tomorrow's. That's what made him dangerous. The squadron commander at Island 12, Colonel Macklin, saw it clearly. He's brilliant, but brilliance doesn't win wars, discipline does. The colonel wasn't wrong. For every pilot like Reeves, there were 10 buried at sea who thought they were invincible. But Macklin also knew that if anyone could pull off the impossible, it was Reeves. The convoy steaming toward the northern straits would test that theory. On the evening of May 11, 1944, Reeves sat alone in the maintenance shed, sketching diagrams in the dust on the floor. Arrows, altitudes, fuses, blast radii. Hale found him there and watched silently for a moment before speaking. "You're really gonna do it, aren't you?" Reeves looked up. "Do what? Fly the 200-foot run?" Reeves smiled faintly. "Not just one, as many as it takes." Hale leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You realize the brass will hang you for this if you survive it." Reeves wiped his hands on his jacket and stood up. "If I survive it, they'll thank me." The next morning, he gathered his crew and explained the plan, not officially, but quietly, over cold coffee and exhaustion. They listened in disbelief. Hale cursed under his breath. The others stared at Reeves as though he was already dead. But something in his voice, calm, certain, unbreakable, made them believe. "We've been fighting by their rules too long. Time to make our own." And so, as the tropical sun climbed over the horizon, painting the ocean gold, the forbidden technique ceased being theory. The mechanics checked the bomb fuses twice. The pilots exchanged nervous smiles. Reeves climbed into his cockpit, strapped in, and throttled up. The engines roared to life. 200 feet, he whispered, the words like a prayer. Night descended over the Pacific like a closing fist, heavy, humid, and silent except for the low hum of distant engines. The sea, dark as spilled oil, reflected a thin sliver of moonlight that shimmered across the waves like broken glass. Somewhere beyond that horizon, 12 enemy ships had become 9. Captain Daniel Reeves had made his point. The forbidden 200-foot run wasn't theory anymore, it was lethal proof. But now, Command wanted answers, and the enemy wanted revenge. By dusk, the base at Island 12 was a chaos of activity. Mechanics scrambled around the airstrip, refueling and rearming the aircraft under the glow of yellow lamps. The smell of aviation fuel hung thick in the air, mingled with the tang of sweat and salt. Reeves sat in the briefing tent, stripped down to his undershirt, his face still streaked with oil. His commanding officer, Colonel Macklin, stood at the head of the table, reading a report that shook in his hands. 3 ships destroyed, Macklin said slowly, disbelief lacing his tone. 2 more crippled. And you came back in one piece? He looked up, his eyes cold. You disobeyed a direct order, Captain. Reeves met his gaze without flinching. I got results, sir. That's not the point. Macklin slammed the folder shut. You could have gotten your entire crew killed. Reeves stood, his voice calm but sharp. With respect, sir, we've been flying by the book for 3 years and losing this war by the same rules. The convoy was right where I said it'd be, and they never saw us coming. You want to ground me? Fine, but that won't stop me from knowing what works. The tent went quiet. Outside, thunder rolled far off over the horizon. Hale sat in the corner, arms folded, trying not to grin. Macklin rubbed his temples, sighed, and leaned back in his chair. You've got guts, Reeves. Too damn much of it. If this stunt hadn't worked, I'd have you court-martialed right now. But, he paused, you're going back out. Reeves blinked. Sir? You heard me. Intelligence says the convoy's limping toward the North Strait. They've called in reinforcements, but they're scattered. You've got a narrow window. Hit them before dawn. You'll fly alone. No formation, no support. Reeves smiled faintly. Just how I like it. Macklin's jaw tightened. This isn't a victory lap, Captain. It's cleanup. Make sure they don't reach the coast. And Reeves, he hesitated, come back alive this time. The night air was thick with humidity as Reeves and Hale approached the flight line. The mechanics worked in silence, their faces lit by the flicker of welding torches. The low blow gleamed faintly under the floodlights, its patched skin reflecting the orange glow of the lamps. Each bomb had been fitted with Reeves' custom 3-second delay fuses, a design the armorers had started calling Reeves Specials. Hale climbed into the cockpit, glancing over his shoulder at the mechanics. They think we're crazy, you know. Reeves strapped himself in, his voice steady. They're right. The engines coughed, then roared to life. The runway lights flickered on, guiding them toward the edge of the dark sea. The island fell away beneath them as they climbed to a mere 500 feet, high enough to clear the reef, low enough to vanish from radar. The moon hung behind scattered clouds, casting a dim silver sheen across the water. 2 hours to target, Hale said, checking his watch. Reeves nodded, eyes fixed ahead. They'll never expect a night strike. They flew without radio chatter, without navigation lights. The only sound was the rumble of the engines and the soft rush of wind through the cockpit vents. Below them, the sea seemed to glow faintly, a reflection of phosphorescent plankton stirred by the waves. It looked almost peaceful. But then the first shadows appeared on the horizon, faint specks against the moonlight, barely visible but unmistakable. Ships. 9 of them. The convoy had regrouped, limping forward in a ragged line. Reeves' hands tightened on the controls. Targets confirmed, Hale whispered. Copy, Reeves replied. Bomb bay doors armed. He descended gradually, 400 feet, 300 feet, then 200 feet. The altimeter needle trembled again, dancing dangerously near the red line. The world narrowed to a tunnel of black sky and gleaming water. Ahead, the first ship's silhouette loomed larger, its searchlights cutting through the dark. They see us! Hale shouted. Tracer fire erupted from the convoy, streams of orange and red arcing across the sky. Reeves banked hard left, the aircraft shuddering as bullets tore through the air around them. Hold steady, he barked. The sea seemed to reach up at them as he leveled out again, skimming barely above the waves. "Bombs away!" The first 2 bombs fell cleanly, splashing into the water just short of a fuel transport. 3 seconds later, the sea exploded. A geyser of flame and water shot 50 feet into the air, engulfing the ship's stern. Reeves banked away as the blast wave buffeted the plane. "That's 1, Hale yelled. But there was no time to celebrate. Anti-aircraft guns blazed from the escorts, their tracers stitching the darkness. A shell burst near the left wing, rattling the cockpit. Reeves fought the controls, teeth clenched. We're good, he muttered. He looped wide, coming back around for another run. The convoy was in chaos now, ships veering, searchlights stabbing the night. Reeves dove again, the altimeter needle sinking dangerously low. Hale's hands gripped the console. "Dan, you're too low!" "Trust me." At 180 feet, Reeves released another pair of bombs. They struck the water just off the bow of a destroyer. The blast lifted the ship out of the water, splitting it in 2. Flames illuminated the sky as fragments rained into the sea. Reeves pulled up sharply, the engines screaming. 2 down, 7 to go. By the 3rd run, the enemy had begun to adapt. Searchlights converged on the bomber and flak bursts bloomed all around them. Reeves zigzagged between columns of smoke and fire, sweat pouring down his neck. The smell of aviation fuel filled the cockpit. "We can't keep this up," Hale said through gritted teeth. "Yes, we can." Reeves' voice was cold, steady. "1 more pass." He swung around again, targeting a pair of supply ships sailing side by side. He dropped 4 bombs in a perfect line. The delayed fuses detonated in sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, turning the water into a wall of fire. The shockwaves tore through both ships, breaking their backs. Hale stared in disbelief. "You just sank 2 with 1 run!" Reeves didn't answer. He was already pulling the throttle wide open, climbing to 500 feet as debris pelted the fuselage. The radio crackled with static, base command calling frantically. "Eagle 1, report! Are you under fire?" Reeves finally keyed the mic. "Negative. We're in the fire." They turned south, limping home on low fuel. Behind them, the ocean burned, an inferno of oil and wreckage stretching across miles. Reeves glanced once over his shoulder, watching the glow fade into the distance. "That's 5, he murmured. 5. In 2 days. When they landed back at Island 12, dawn was breaking. The entire base had gathered by the runway, watching as the low blow came in with smoke trailing from its left engine. Reeves taxied to a stop, climbed out, and stood atop the wing. His uniform was soaked in sweat, his face streaked with grime. The men erupted in cheers. Hale leaned against the fuselage, exhausted, laughing. Colonel Macklin pushed through the crowd, looking up at the pilot. "You disobeyed again," he said, his tone half reprimand, half awe. Reeves nodded. "Yes, sir." Macklin looked past him toward the horizon, where faint plumes of smoke still rose against the sunrise. "How many this time?" 4 sunk, 1 crippled. The colonel's jaw dropped. 5? In 1 night? Reeves stepped down from the wing, his expression calm. "They'll be back tomorrow," he said softly. "So will we." That night, the men of Island 12 didn't sleep. They worked through the dark, rearming, repairing, preparing for what everyone now knew was coming. The final strike. The enemy would regroup, desperate and angry, but so would Reeves. The first night strike had proved the impossible was real. The next 2 days would prove something greater. That courage, when pushed beyond fear, could reshape the fate of an ocean. The sea burned for 3 days straight. When the sun rose over the Pacific on the morning of May 13th, the horizon was still veiled with a dirty orange haze, the smoke of a dying convoy drifting slowly westward. The reports had already reached Fleet Command. One American bomber, flying below radar, had destroyed half a Japanese supply fleet in less than 48 hours. They called it impossible. They called it luck. But for Captain Daniel Reeves and his crew, it was just the beginning. The base at Island 12 trembled with energy. Men who had spent months repairing aircraft or hauling ammunition suddenly believed they were part of something legendary. The low blow had returned with bullet holes in her wings and scorch marks across her fuselage, yet she stood gleaming in the dawn light, a scarred veteran ready for one more fight. Mechanics swarmed around her, patching, fueling, arming, as Reeves stood nearby, silent, eyes fixed on the sea. He hadn't slept since the previous night's mission. His hands shook when he lit a cigarette, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "They'll regroup," he told Hale, "and when they do, we'll finish 'em." Hale, exhausted but loyal, nodded. "You think command will still let us fly?" Reeves smirked faintly. "They don't have to let us. The ocean's waiting." By noon, word came in from reconnaissance. The remnants of the convoy, 7 ships at most, were limping north toward the shoals, escorted by 2 destroyers diverted from a nearby port. If they reached open sea, they'd vanish into Japan's defense ring. Reeves didn't wait for orders. He gathered his crew under the wing of the bomber. "This is it. 3 days. That's all it's taken to choke their supply line. We end it today." The men nodded, some out of belief, some out of fear. There was no bravado now, only resolve. The airfield buzzed with urgency. Everyone knew this might be the last run. Even Colonel Macklin, who had once called Reeves reckless, gave him a silent nod as the engine started up. The bomber rolled down the coral runway, its shadow flickering across the palms. The air shimmered with heat. Reeves pushed the throttle forward, and the engine screamed. The low blow leapt into the sky, cutting through the humidity like a blade. Clouds gathered overhead, thick and low, casting the sea below in shades of gray. It was perfect cover. Hale adjusted the instruments, his voice calm but tight. 2 hours to target, weather's turning rough. Reeves smiled without humor. "Good, let's give them a storm." They flew north into the squall. Rain lashed the cockpit canopy, thunder rolled and lightning flashed on the horizon. Reeves flew by instinct, hands steady, eyes flicking between the altimeter and the angry ocean below. When they finally broke through the storm wall, the sight ahead made Hale curse under his breath. The convoy was there, 7 ships, spread out but still moving in formation, smoke trailing from damaged stacks. The destroyers prowled along the edges, alert and waiting. Reeves dropped lower, the altimeter needle trembling at 200 feet. The ocean spray hit the windows like sand. "You're not serious," Hale muttered. Reeves didn't respond. He was already lining up the attack vector. Bomb bay doors open, fuses set to 3 seconds. The first run was surgical. Reeves approached from the east, sunlight flickering off the waves. The destroyers opened fire immediately, tracers slicing the air, flak blooming in black clouds. Reeves weaved through them, the engines howling, the plane vibrating with every near miss. "Now," he shouted. The bombs fell clean, splashing into the sea beside a cargo ship. The explosion tore the vessel apart, a column of fire rising into the clouds. Reeves banked left, the shock wave slamming the plane sideways. Hale's voice crackled through the intercom. "You took her apart, that's 6." Reeves ignored him. He was already diving again, turning toward the next target. The destroyers were closing in, their guns tracking the bomber's every move. Shells burst around them, fragments hammering the fuselage. "We're hit," Hale yelled. Smoke filled the cockpit. Reeves coughed, eyes watering, but his grip on the controls never wavered. "We're fine. Hold it steady." The right engine sputtered, then steadied. Reeves dropped lower, skimming just above the waves, water spraying up behind them. He aimed for the lead destroyer, its deck aflame with gunfire. "Bombs away!" 2 more fell, trailing smoke. The explosions engulfed the destroyer in a wave of white fire. When the smoke cleared, it was gone. The second destroyer veered to avoid the wreckage. Reeves turned sharply, lining up for another pass. "We're going again," he said. Hale stared at him, pale. "Dan, we're leaking fuel." Then we'd better make the next one count. The last run was chaos. The sea was boiling with debris and flame. The remaining ships fired wildly into the sky, their tracers crisscrossing like lightning. Reeves plunged straight through the storm of fire, the world reduced to vibration and noise. He dropped his last 4 bombs in sequence, the explosions merging into one massive shockwave. The pressure lifted the bomber like a toy, the engine screaming in protest. Hale's shout was drowned out by the roar. Reeves fought the controls, pulling hard, the G-forces crushing him into a seat. For a moment, everything went white. The next thing he knew, they were clear, rising above a sea of wreckage. The convoy was gone, every ship either burning or sinking. The ocean glowed red beneath them. Reeves exhaled slowly, his voice hoarse. "That's 12, he whispered. Hale slumped in her seat, staring at the devastation below. 3 days, he murmured. You sank 12 ships in 3 days. Reeves said nothing. He just stared at the horizon where the fires met the sky. The radio crackled with static, then the voice of base command. Eagle 1, return immediately. Repeat, return immediately. You've done enough. But Reeves didn't feel victorious. His hands trembled as he adjusted the controls. His ears rang from the explosions. He could still hear the thunder of the blasts echoing in his skull. He'd done what no one thought possible, but at a cost only he could understand. As the bomber limped home, its engines coughing, he looked down at the burning sea. The line between courage and madness had vanished somewhere over that water. When the low blow touched down on Island 12 hours later, the entire base was waiting. Mechanics, officers, cooks, medics, every man and woman on the island stood along the runway as the bomber rolled to a stop, smoke trailing from its engines. Reeves climbed out slowly, his face gray with exhaustion. Hale followed, one arm bandaged where shrapnel had torn through the cockpit. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Reeves didn't hear them. He looked out at the sea beyond the palms, still glowing faintly from distant fires, and felt nothing but quiet. Colonel Macklin approached him, saluting him. 12 ships in 3 days, the colonel said softly. I've never seen anything like it. Reeves nodded. Neither have I, sir. Command's calling you a hero. Reeves shook his head. Heroes follow orders. Macklin smiled faintly. Maybe it's time the orders caught up. That night the base fell silent again. The sky over the Pacific was clear, the stars cold and distant. Reeves sat alone by the runway, staring at the horizon where the fires had been. The ocean was black now, calm, indifferent. The war would move on, but those 3 days of fury would live forever in the wreckage beneath the waves, in the whispers of pilots who'd swear they saw a bomber flying lower than the sea, and in the eyes of one man who had defied death, gravity, and command to prove that sometimes the forbidden path is the only one that leads to victory. The morning after the 3rd day of fire was unnaturally quiet. The sea had gone still, as if holding its breath after witnessing what had unfolded. The men at Island 12 walked like ghosts across the airfield, their ears still ringing from the echoes of explosions that had burned through their dreams. The air smelled of oil and salt, mixed with the faint sweetness of victory. But for Captain Daniel Reeves, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. He sat on an overturned crate near his plane, cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring at the holes in the fuselage of the low blow. Each dent and scorch mark told a story, a price paid in courage and madness. Hale sat beside him, his arm in a sling, a grin tugging weakly at his face. 12 ships, Dan. You realize that? You did what a whole squadron couldn't do in a month. Reeves didn't look up. We did it. And don't remind me. They'll either pin a medal on us or shoot us for it. Hale laughed, wincing from the pain in his shoulder. I'll take the medal first. But Reeves wasn't smiling. He knew what came next. No man disobeyed orders and walked away unscathed, not even a victorious one. By noon, the call came from Fleet Headquarters. An inspection team was inbound. The brass wanted answers, official reports, debriefings, and explanations for how one pilot had managed to turn a regulation bomber into a weapon of legend. Colonel Macklin met Reeves outside the operations tent, his face drawn but proud. "They're sending a delegation from Fleet Command," he said quietly. "3 officers, maybe 4. They'll land by evening. You'll need to explain your methods." Reeves stubbed out his cigarette. "They don't want an explanation. They want a confession." Macklin sighed. "Then give them both." The transport plane arrived at dusk, kicking up clouds of coral dust as it landed. From it stepped 3 men in crisp uniforms and polished boots, officers who smelled of office paper and air conditioning, not salt or gunpowder. They introduced themselves briskly: Commodore Allen, Fleet Engineer Lawson, and Commander Yates from Intelligence. Their eyes moved from Reeves to the battered low blow and back again, expressions unreadable. "Captain Reeves," the Commodore began, "you're aware that your last 3 missions directly violated standing air combat regulations?" Reeves nodded. "Yes, sir." "You're also aware," Allen continued, "that the results of those missions have altered the course of our naval campaign?" Another nod. "Then, Captain," the Commodore said, leaning forward, "we find ourselves in a rare position. We don't know whether to court-martial you or promote you." Reeves glanced at Hale, who smirked. "Can we do both?" The officers didn't laugh. They wanted details. Reeves was ordered into the briefing tent, where maps and photographs littered the table. The Commodore gestured toward them. "Walk us through it, Captain. Every maneuver, every modification, every violation." Reeves stood straight, his voice calm. He described the low-altitude approach, the delayed fuses, the shock-wave effect of the bombs detonating beneath the hulls. He drew diagrams in pencil on the map, showing how the water amplified the blasts, how the explosions crippled ships even without direct hits. He explained the timing, 3 seconds exactly, and the risks: crosswinds, turbulence, anti-aircraft fire. The room was silent except for the scratch of pencils as the officers took notes. When he finished, the Commodore leaned back, folding his arms. "You realize what you've done, Captain. You've rewritten the book on aerial anti-ship warfare." "No, sir," Reeves said quietly. "I just stopped reading it." The Commodore stared at him for a long moment, then spoke. "Officially, this tactic is reckless. Unofficially," he paused, glancing at the others, "it may have saved an entire invasion fleet." Lawson, the engineer, tapped his pen. "The Japanese won't recover from this for months. Their convoys are in chaos. You've cut off their supply chain to the Philippines. Our ground forces owe you their next step forward." Reeves didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about strategy. He was thinking about the faces of the men who hadn't made it back from missions like his. The sea didn't care about medals. It took everyone equally. "We've decided," the Commodore said finally. "No court-martial. Not officially. Fleet Command will classify your missions as experimental anti-shipping tests, authorized retroactively." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Retroactively?" "Meaning," the Commodore continued, "you never disobeyed orders because there were no orders to disobey. Congratulations, Captain." The words landed like a stone. Reeves saluted mechanically. "Thank you, sir." But there was no joy in his voice. The meeting dissolved into paperwork and signatures. Macklin clapped him on the shoulder afterwards, grinning. "You did it, Dan. You won." Reeves shook his head. "No, Colonel. We just survived." That night the base threw a celebration. The cooks raided the stores for canned fruit and whiskey. The mechanics strung lanterns between the palm trees. The airfield echoed with laughter for the first time in months. Someone painted 12 red ship silhouettes under the low blow's nose art, a silent tribute to the destruction she had dealt. Reeves stood apart from the party, leaning against the fuselage, watching the lanterns sway in the warm wind. Hale joined him, holding 2 tin cups of whiskey. "You're supposed to be celebrating, Dan," he said, handing one over. Reeves took it but didn't drink. "I'm not sure what we're celebrating," he said quietly. "We did our job." "You changed the war, Dan." Reeves looked out toward the dark horizon where the sea met the stars. "No," he said, "the war just changed us." A few days later, the orders came through. Reeves was reassigned to Fleet Headquarters as a consultant, tasked with training new bomber squadrons in low-altitude tactics. Officially, they called it Operation Tidebreaker. Unofficially, everyone called it Reeves' Run. He spent long hours briefing young pilots, teaching them how to read the ocean, how to time their drops, how to trust instinct over instruments. But for all his knowledge, none of them could fly it the way he had. They were taught limits. He had flown beyond them. Hale stayed behind on Island 12, overseeing the next generation of bombers. The low blow, too damaged for another mission, was retired to the far end of the runway. Her engines were stripped, her nose art faded, but to the men who'd served there, she was a relic of defiance, a reminder that one plane, one crew, one act of disobedience could tilt the balance of a war. In the months that followed, the 200-foot bombing run became part of Allied strategy, adapted, modified, made safer. Fleets across the Pacific used it to devastating effect, crippling Japanese shipping routes. Reeves's name appeared in reports but never in headlines. He didn't want it there. The glory belonged to those who hadn't made it home. When the war ended, Reeves returned to a country that barely recognized his kind of heroism. The medals came, the commendations, the polite applause, but none of it mattered. He knew that behind every victory lay the shadow of those 3 days. The roar of engines, the flash of fire, the faces of men who'd stared death in the eye and flown anyway. Years later, when journalists tracked him down, asking about the legend of the forbidden 200-foot run, he gave the same answer every time. It wasn't about being brave, it was about doing what needed to be done when no one else would. And when they pressed him for details, for how it felt to fly so low, to cheat death and rewrite the rules, he would smile faintly, light a cigarette, and say, "Ask the ocean. It remembers." When the war finally ended, silence rolled over the Pacific like a tide, erasing all sound. The guns went quiet, the engines stopped roaring, and the sky, once streaked with smoke and flame, returned to its natural blue. But beneath those calm waters lay the ghosts of 1,000 battles. Wrecks of steel and fire rested on the ocean floor, each one a chapter of human defiance. Among them, somewhere in the deep trenches north of the Philippines, lay the broken hulls of 12 Japanese ships, sunken by one man's forbidden run. Their twisted frames were corroded by salt, but the legend that sent them there refused to rust. On Island 12, the war's end felt unreal. The once bustling airfield was quiet, its tents half-empty, its radio silent. The low blow still sat at the far end of the runway, stripped of her engines but untouched otherwise. Her faded pin-up girl and 12 crimson ship silhouettes remained, weathered but proud. The men who stayed behind said that when the wind blew just right, they could still hear the faint echo of her engines, the low, steady hum of a bomber that had once dared the impossible. Captain Daniel Reeves didn't return to the island. After his reassignment, he'd spent the rest of the war teaching others what he'd learned the hard way. He hated the classroom. Charts and diagrams couldn't capture the chaos of the real thing, the way the sea bucked under your wings, the way tracer rounds looked like fiery beads stringing death across the night. He tried to explain that the 200-foot run wasn't about calculation, it was about feel. About reading the rhythm of the waves, the heartbeat of the wind, and the pulse of survival. But those things couldn't be taught. They had to be lived. When the surrender finally came, Reeves stood alone on a balcony overlooking San Francisco Bay, watching ships return home with victory pennants flying. He didn't cheer. He felt hollow. He'd spent so long flying toward death that peace felt unnatural. The papers called him a hero. Command gave him medals. But inside, Reeves knew medals were just metal. They didn't silence the memory of engines screaming through the dark or the faces of men who hadn't made it back. In interviews, reporters begged him for stories. "How did it feel to fly so low?" they asked. "Were you afraid?" Reeves always answered the same way. "Fear's not the enemy. Complacency is." Then he'd walk away, leaving their notebooks half-filled and their curiosity unsatisfied. Years passed and the world moved on. Jet planes replaced propellers. Bombers grew faster, sleeker, deadlier. But in every aviation academy, in every naval strategy manual, there was a quiet nod to the man who had rewritten the rules. They called it Reeves' technique now. Sanitized, measured, safe. It no longer carried the sting of rebellion. The textbook spoke of optimized low-altitude attack profiles, not the nights of chaos and fire that had birthed the idea. But among pilots, the old stories still circulated, of a man who had flown lower than logic and higher than fear, who had bent the ocean to his will. In Japan, the sunken convoy became legend too. Divers decades later found the wreck still lying in a neat trail along the seabed as if frozen mid-flight. They called it the Path of the 12. Naval historians argued endlessly over the reports, some claiming that no single bomber could have caused such devastation, others swearing by the eyewitness accounts of burning ships vanishing beneath the waves. But the truth didn't care who believed it. It was written in the steel bones of the ocean. As for Reeves, he disappeared quietly into civilian life. He bought a small house near the coast where the roar of waves reminded him of propellers. Neighbors described him as polite, distant, always watching the horizon. He never married, never talked about the war, but sometimes at night locals said they could see him standing on the beach, staring out at the sea, cigarette glowing in the dark. One boy who dared to approach him once asked, "Mister, did you really sink 12 ships all by yourself?" Reeves had smiled, eyes tired but kind. "Not by myself, son. The sea helped." That was the last anyone heard him speak of it. He died years later quietly, his service medals tucked away in a wooden box under his bed. But when word spread, veterans, mechanics, and old shipmates came from across the country to attend his funeral. They lined the shore as a military flyover passed overhead, planes roaring low, their shadows skimming the waves in a silent salute. As the final aircraft banked into the sun, one pilot broke formation, diving down to within 200 feet of the water before pulling sharply skyward. The crowd gasped, then cheered. It was the forbidden run, reborn for one last time. Afterwards, they scattered his ashes into the sea. The water took him the way it took everything, quietly, completely, respectfully. The waves closed, and for a moment the sunlight caught the surface, flashing silver, as if the ocean itself were saluting him. Years later, when the rusted wreck of the Loblo was found on Island 12, half buried under vines and sand, historians restored it as a monument. The old paint was still faintly visible, the pinup girl, the name, the 12 red ships. On the plaque below, they inscribed his words: "Rules don't win wars. Results do." Today, pilots still whisper his story before their first low-level mission. They call it the run that defied the sky. And when they descend through clouds toward the sea, throttles wide, altimeters trembling, some swear they can almost hear another engine beside them, ghostly, steady, fearless. The spirit of the man who had flown lower than fear and left his legend in the deep. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Liberty ships, those unassuming, box-shaped workhorses of war, drifted into peace like tired soldiers returning home. The sea that had once swallowed them in fire and fury now reflected calm skies, and the shipyards that had once thundered with industry grew still. For the first time in years, the sparks stopped flying, the whistles stopped blowing, and the cranes stood motionless. But though the sound of the war had faded, the echo of what Henry Kaiser and his workers had accomplished still shook the world. The Liberty ship was more than a vessel. It was a symbol, a testament to what humanity could achieve when imagination replaced limitation. It had been called the ship that won the war, and rightly so. Yet its true victory was not in battle, but in time. The Liberty ship redefined how quickly human will could be transformed into steel reality. What once took months now took days. What once seemed impossible had become routine. The world had discovered a new kind of power, the power of speed through unity. When the war ended, many Liberty ships were sold off, scrapped, or converted for peacetime trade. They carried wheat instead of ammunition, coal instead of tanks, refugees instead of soldiers. Some were transformed into floating hospitals, others became cargo liners or training vessels. A few ended their days rusting in quiet harbors, their names fading under peeling paint. John Adams, Spirit of Kansas, Robert E. Peary, ghosts of an era that had changed the world. But even as their hulls aged, their spirit endured, rippling through every industry that followed. Henry Kaiser himself refused to rest. To him, war had only proven what peace could accomplish. If we can build a ship in 4 days, then we can build hospitals, homes, and highways the same way. He turned his attention to rebuilding America, constructing massive housing developments for returning veterans, creating healthcare systems for his workers, the seed of what would become Kaiser Permanente, and building the automobiles that would power the next generation of prosperity. The techniques born in the shipyards, prefabrication, modular construction, mass coordination, became the blueprint for the modern world. The post-war years became a golden age of innovation, and Kaiser's legacy was everywhere. Prefabricated buildings rose in record time. Factories adopted just-in-time manufacturing. Airplane and automobile production followed the same principles that had built Liberty ships: divide, simplify, assemble. Even NASA, decades later, would apply similar ideas to the Apollo program, coordinating thousands of independent components into one functioning whole. The impossible trick of the Liberty ship had become the foundation of modern progress. But beyond the engineering and industry lay something deeper, a moral legacy. The Liberty ships had proven that freedom could outbuild tyranny, that ordinary people, when united by a common cause, could surpass the grandest empires. They showed that democracy was not chaos, as dictators claimed, but organized energy, self-driven, self-correcting, endlessly creative. The totalitarian states of the world had ruled by command. Kaiser's America had ruled by cooperation. And in that difference lay the secret of victory. For the men and women who had built those ships, the end of the war brought a strange silence. Many struggled to adjust to peacetime, to the quiet after years of ceaseless motion. Some returned to their farms, their factories, their families. Others stayed in industry, teaching the next generation how to weld, how to design, how to build. Yet all of them carried the same memory: the glow of molten steel at midnight, the roar of a launch, the knowledge that their hands had built something that changed the world. Historians would later say that the Liberty ships were not elegant, nor enduring, nor even particularly safe. Some cracked under stress, some sank in storms, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that they existed. In the thousands, when the world needed them most, they proved that victory was not the work of heroes alone, but of many hands working as one. Henry Kaiser lived to see his dream vindicated. When asked late in life what he was most proud of, he didn't mention the Hoover Dam or his post-war empire. He simply said, "We proved what people can do when they believe in each other." Those words became the final line in the story of the Liberty ship, a story not of machines, but of minds. Even now, a handful of Liberty ships remain. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien and SS John W. Brown have been restored as floating museums, their decks echoing with the footsteps of visitors who marvel at their size and simplicity. The welds, rough and hand-laid, still hold firm. The engines still rumble. They sail occasionally on anniversaries and parades, symbols of endurance in an age that forgets how fragile time once was. When they glide across the water, they carry with them the ghosts of the millions who labored unseen: welders, riveters, inspectors, clerks, sailors, the citizens who built a miracle in steel. And as they move, slowly and proudly, one can almost hear the voices of the past in the wind, the clang of hammers, the laughter in the shipyards, the chants of workers launching another ship into the sea. They remind us that progress isn't born in palaces or laboratories alone, but in the calloused hands of people who refuse to stop trying. The Liberty ship's legacy is not confined to history books. It lives wherever humanity faces impossible odds and chooses to build anyway. It lives in the spirit of cooperation, in the factories that never sleep, in every emergency bridge, hospital, or spacecraft assembled by teams who know that together nothing is impossible. It is the story of how one civilian, a builder of dams who had never gone to sea, defied the laws of time and proved that vision is the most powerful weapon